Clickbait title: We got food poisoning. Welcome, everyone, to the Week I Review. My name is Alec Kubas-meyer, and today I want to talk about a place, Nuevo Vallarta, Mexico. Now, this is not the more well-known Puerto Vallarta, which contains the airport that one flies into if they're trying to get to Nuevo Vallarta. In fact, despite their names and proximity, the two aren't even in the same state. Puerto Vallarta is in Jalisco, Nuevo in Nayarit. I apologize well in advance for any and all Spanish language butchering that takes place over the next however many minutes. Blame the American education system. Nuevo Vallarta is interesting because it's not really a place for people to live, but for them to vacation. It's a city of resorts. According to the most recent census data in 2010, there were 1,302 people there. And though I came across other estimates ranging from 500 to over 100,000, nice going, Wikipedia page that calls itself out for a complete lack of sourcing, 1,300 makes sense. At the same time, TripAdvisor lists 41 separate temporary lodgings, hotels, B&Bs, etc., meaning that the capacity for outsiders dwarfs the permanent population. So it's pretty clear what's what. Speaking of pretty, this is the view from the lobby of the Occidental Nuevo Vallarta, where I stayed with my family and a whole host of other families who were part of or related to a Peace Corps group 40 years ago. This is the lobby itself. This is the beach. My gosh, right? The Occidental is an all-inclusive resort, which means that your basic needs, food, drinks, Michael Jackson impersonators, are covered. It's a place meant for you to relax. You don't have to sweat the small stuff or the big stuff. It's the kind of place you'd expect in a city devoted exclusively to tourism, and I don't mean that derisively. A city whose sole industry is tourism may be a risky bet that could result in a decimated economy should the whims of an ever more fickle public change, even more so for typically international destinations. But as long as people are willing to buy, they can continue to thrive. Nuevo Vallarta certainly looks like it's thriving, with the construction of even more resorts going on while I was there. But the benefits of these industries are often hyper-localized. The last time I went to an all-inclusive resort was a decade ago, with many of the same people. It was in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. That resort, too, was gorgeous. I've always described it as walking into a postcard, which now feels like an outdated concept and would today probably have been a reference to Instagram, but outside the resort enclave, it was a completely different and extremely poor world. Chris Rock said it well in his most recent comedy special, The First in 14 Years. I'm not going to repeat the joke because I lack his comedic timing, but I will put the text of it over my face for the next 10 to 15 seconds while I continue talking, a move that makes no sense since the majority of people can't keep track of two simultaneous inputs. But if I was doing this whole thing right, my clickbait titles wouldn't just be my opening line. You should watch that special, by the way. It's called Tambourine, and it was directed by Bo Burnham, whose own Make Happy is probably my favorite comedy special of all time. They're both on Netflix. Netflix has great comedy specials, like Hannah Gadsby's Nanette, which has deservedly broken out into the mainstream for its deconstruction of the form. But I'm not talking about Netflix comedy specials. Not today, anyway. Today, I'm talking about Mexico. And the drive from Puerto Vallarta Airport was not particularly depressing. In fact, I was more struck by how familiar it was as I passed by Domino's, Carl's Jr., and the Home Depot. But I never saw Puerto Vallarta beyond that. In fact, I didn't leave the hotel at all for the first 2/3 of the 6-day trip. This was partially a result of my intense desire to just chill out, but it was also because my girlfriend Danielle got food poisoning. They say you shouldn't drink the water on trips like these, lest you end up like that one character in the Sex and the City movie, and for the first couple of days I didn't. I stayed with bottled and the presumably filtered stuff that they had at their bars and restaurants. But at some point, I switched over to the occasional top-off from the tap, and it was fine. So it probably wasn't the water that got her, but we don't know what did. It only happened to her. Her version of this review would likely be less positive. The all-inclusive nature of the Occidental is as such. Access to the buffet, a couple of visits to their fancier restaurants, pool, beach, etc., and free-flowing alcohol. I don't drink, so the latter doesn't hold particular appeal for me, but they had a truly delicious non-alcoholic concoction called a Copacabana, which I have sadly been unable to find the recipe for. Everyone else has boozed it up. I was told by those that indulged that the drinks tended to be on the weaker side, which I imagine was partially an economic decision and partially one to minimize the number of patrons who die of alcohol poisoning after spending an entire day drinking in 90-something degree heat. The makeup of those patrons was interesting to me. The hotel was not, as I expected, full of Americans, or even Europeans, as many of the visitors Punta Cana were. They were, by and large, Mexicans. The relative whiteness of my group stood out, so much so that a young woman from Guadalajara asked why we were there instead of Cancun, though I think the answer to that question is in the meta context of the question itself. On the plane, I played Mario Kart 8 like I was in a commercial for the Nintendo Switch with a 23-year-old financial analyst who was going to Cabo for the weekend. Because of course he was. Because that's where people like that go, there in Cancun. I live in New York City. I get enough of Americans in general and finance bros in particular in my daily life. I don't need to see them when I'm vacationing too. We went during the off-season, which meant that, aside from a general lack of Americans, there was an overall lack of people. It never felt crowded anywhere that I was. Only once in the whole trip did I see a pool that looked like it had enough people. And I wasn't looking to swim at the time, so it didn't even matter. I was probably on my way to lunch. Lunch was great. I was honestly a bit shocked at the quality of the buffet. I looked forward to going there for every meal. The restaurants they had were pretty good too, with the sushi hibachi place being particularly unique. While the moves the man was doing were familiar, the flavors were unexpected. Little did I know a main ingredient in Mexican sushi is cream cheese. But as much as I enjoyed the food, I also just enjoyed the act of eating with this view. The day after I returned, I went back to work and had lunch at a hot bar buffet staring at a midtown parking lot. It was depressing. Danielle improved for the back half of the trip, and we decided to get touristy. This took two forms, a trip to the nearby town of Sayulita, and then a boat excursion to Las Margaritas Island. Both were gorgeous in totally different ways. Sayulita blew me away with its colors, ones that were so vibrant I don't think it's even possible for a digital screen to replicate it. I had seen buildings painted that way in movies and photographs, but there's really nothing like seeing it yourself. Las Margaritas is a small island bird sanctuary that we weren't allowed to touch but could snorkel around. It too was beautiful, though the experience was somewhat marred by the fact that I was stung by literally hundreds of jellyfish. Literally, not figuratively, literally, in order to get from the boat to the little cove we swam in, we had no choice but to swim through schools of small jellyfish, each of which stung like a tiny little gnat. Some folks went back to the boat, but we didn't. The stings were unpleasant, but it was worth it. And the crew did a pretty great show at the end with some dancing. I was a big fan of that. Speaking of dancing, this is a minion doing Michael Jackson choreography. 8.9 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. This video is one of the first 4 being posted to this new channel as a day 1 celebration. Each one focuses on something radically different to give a sense of the breadth of my interests. Next Monday begins the weekly experiment. I hope you'll join me in that. There's a button down below that will let you do it, as well as a pair of thumbs to let me know that you care enough to have an opinion, positive or negative. And hey, maybe you heard something and want to engage further. Do it. Hit me up on Twitter or in the comments. If you've got thoughts, I probably want to hear them. I hope to see you next week.